on state foreign operations and related programs will come to order. Secretary Pompeo, while it has taken some time for you to come before the subcommittee, and we realize you are traveling all around the world, I do want to thank you for joining us today. It is important that this subcommittee, with direct jurisdiction over your department's funding, hears from you on the fiscal year 2020 budget. Before I address the President's inadequate 2020 budget request, I must respond to the Mexico City announcement you made yesterday. Your additional expansion of the global gag rule compromises our ability to support comprehensive, life-saving care to those most in need. International NGOs should not be forced to choose between accepting life-saving assistance from the United States or providing legal, comprehensive care with their own funds. This policy expansion could dramatically impede the effectiveness of our foreign assistance and life-saving programs. Not to mention, this type of coercion runs contrary to the basic tenets of freedom that our country was founded upon. Excuse me. Is spreading. I hope you're good and healthy and don't have this cough. Now, I want to address your recent comment that President Trump has ensured that the State Department has the resources it needs. Frankly, I find it hard to fathom when his first two budgets proposed cuts to diplomacy and development by more than 30%, and the current request proposes a cut of 21%. These are the resources that the State Department needs. The State Department has never had to operate under the draconian levels proposed by the President, as they have never been approved by the House, even in the Republican majority. This committee consistently provides bipartisan support to maintain United States global leadership, and I'm astonished that 3 years into his administration, the President still does not appreciate the merits of sustained investments in diplomacy and development. Mr. Secretary, I have seen firsthand how United States foreign assistance alleviates suffering and promotes stability. Our efforts, as you well know, saves lives, promote goodwill and partnership, and support American investments and national security. If the President's budget were enacted, it would undermine U.S. leadership and stymie worldwide efforts to counter violent extremism, terrorism, and disinformation. As you know, there is tremendous turmoil around the globe, including increased attacks on democratic principles such as freedom of the press, the rule of law, and the right to free and fair elections. Millions of refugees and internally displaced persons throughout the world, the chaotic situation in Venezuela, the continuing reign of terror of the murderous dictator Bashar al-Assad in Syria, a rapidly expanding global population which further exacerbates conditions that contribute to hunger and poverty, which can lead to conflict and migration. The spread of infectious and neglected tropical diseases, some of which are becoming drug-resistant, and lastly, ongoing threats posed by North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China that undermine the security and prosperity of the United States and our allies. Mr. Secretary, now one of these dangers is positively addressed by shortchanging the federal agencies tasked with executing United States foreign policy. Additionally, I'm concerned about the long-term damage this administration is inflicting on state and U.S. aid through policies that reduce response time, result in inadequate staffing levels and low staff morale, and prevent partnerships with some of the most capable and experienced implementers. There's no better example than the Kemp-Kasten determination against UNFPA, which undermines our effectiveness, making it harder to reach people who need us the most. I'm also very troubled that President Trump seems to view foreign assistance as a reward to our friends and its withdrawal as punishment to our enemies. Moreover, the administration's approach to multilateral engagement at the United Nations, the World Bank, and elsewhere has been reactionary and short-sighted at best. These self-inflicted constraints compromise the quality of our efforts, make it harder to maintain American leadership in the world, create risk to our national security, and are a disservice to the American taxpayer. Our national security is strongest when development, diplomacy, and defense are all well-funded and equally prioritized. As chairwoman, I intend to work with my colleagues to reject the insufficient request and maintain responsible investments in foreign aid. And before we move to your testimony, I would be delighted to turn to Mr. Rogers, the ranking member, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary, welcome back to your old haunting grounds, the House on the Hill. We're proud of your service here in the House when you were here, and we're delighted to see one of us are done good. Mr. Secretary, I firmly believe that strong investments in diplomatic and development programs are a central component of our national security. In fact, our most senior military commanders have told us time and again that these critical tools help provide the means by which we prevent the need for military intervention. That's why I was once again disappointed, frankly, after reviewing the budget request for programs funded by this subcommittee. You say in your congressional budget justification that the request prioritizes the security of U.S. citizens, increases American prosperity, and supports our allies and partners. I believe you would see more support in Congress if the proposed funding level matched that rhetoric. Instead, the request is a cut of nearly $11.5 billion, 21%, from fiscal year 19. Although this year's international affairs request represents some improvements from the previous 2 fiscal years, it is still woefully inadequate to achieve the administration's foreign policy and national security goals. I wholeheartedly agree that taxpayer dollars must be used wisely and that programs need to be more effective and efficient. Lord, yes. I'm committed to working with you and the State Department to find the best ways to do that. But if we were to accept cuts of the magnitude proposed, it would make our nation less safe, make it harder to achieve the effectiveness we all seek. In particular, deep reductions are proposed to important priorities like security assistance, global health, democracy promotion, and even life-saving humanitarian assistance. These programs demonstrate the character of our country. Given what the world looks like right now, this approach seems detached from reality. During a time of record displacement of individuals and families, a growing number of countries facing instability and rising geopolitical tensions, U.S. leadership abroad is even more critical. The budget request we have before us will simply not get that job done. That being said, there are some proposals in your budget I fully support and hope we can pass, including the $3.3 billion for Israel, reflecting our steadfast commitment to Israel's security and military strength. I'm also pleased to see $1.3 billion requested for Egypt's foreign military financing. Yesterday, we celebrated 40 years of peace between these two American allies who have achieved much together, despite perpetually high tensions in that region. I appreciate your continued prioritization of these relations, Mr. Secretary. I also note that the budget request appears to have moved beyond the proposed cuts to personnel levels we've seen in prior years. There's still a long way to go to make up lost ground from the hiring freeze, but I applaud this progress nonetheless. Another priority is the management and oversight of the department. I continue to believe there needs to be a position at the highest levels that brings together both operations and assistance. And you and I have had this conversation several times. But right now, these two sides of the House don't really talk. And that continues to hamper the department's ability to address its management challenges. Ultimately, the legislative branch has the responsibility to equip leaders like yourself with the resources that you need to advance our economic and security interests. And so we are eager to hear from you on these important funding issues today. I also look forward to hearing about your travels. You've just returned from the Middle East, I think. We're interested in your impressions while there. Iran's continued nuclear pursuits, missile development, and support for terrorist activity weigh heavily on our minds as well as yours. Before that trip, you were in Asia. We all want to see North Korea denuclearize and hope that the people of North Korea might one day experience freedom and prosperity. China's role in how that turns out is questionable, as are their motives throughout the globe. The Chinese government's practice of predatory lending to developing countries is not just immoral, it has real security consequences for our partners in the region and beyond. I may return to that during the question period, but I fear much of the world has not awakened to the reality of the potential damage China could do to international security. You've also visited Europe this year, so we would appreciate your update on how we can help assure and defend our allies and partners in Europe. The Russian bear only understands strength. We must do everything in our power to help our friends in Europe stand strong to resist rampant Russian aggression on all fronts. Lastly, you returned from Latin America at the beginning of January. The outcome of the current crisis in Venezuela will shape the future of that region for decades to come. We must remain in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and democratic interim government. A free and democratic Venezuela that can restore what once was a thriving economy is the first step to addressing many of the other challenges in the neighborhood, including combating transnational criminal organizations and stopping the flow of drugs into this country. We can't let Maduro and his cronies further destabilize that whole region. Finally, before I close, I want you to know you have my unwavering support for your efforts to protect the rights of the unborn. We were not provided with the details of your announcement yesterday, but I look forward to receiving a full readout of your plans. Secretary Pompeo, I want to thank you again for your service to your country, as well as the men and women of the department. I hope you will continue to engage with our subcommittee as we begin our work for fiscal year 2020. This is a partnership, and your input is appreciated and valued, and we will be a true partner with you. I yield back.
Thank you. After the Secretary presents his testimony, I will call on members based on seniority of members present when the hearing was called to order. I will alternate between majority and minority. Each member is asked to keep questions to within 5 minutes per round. We will be doing 2 rounds today. Mr. Secretary, we will be happy to place your full testimony in the record. If you would be kind enough to summarize your oral statement, I want to make sure we leave enough time to get to everyone's questions. But Secretary Pompeo, please proceed as you wish.
Chairman Lowey, thank you, and I will absolutely summarize. Chairman Lowey, Ranking Member Rogers, thank you. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for being with me this morning, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss the President's FY 2020 budget. I'm glad I'm here. It's the first hearing in front of the 116th Congress, and I'm glad it is with you all. In order to support the President's national security strategy and achieve our foreign policy goals, we this year submitted a request of $40 billion for the State Department and USAID. It will protect our citizens at home and abroad and advance American prosperity and values. It will support our allies and partners overseas. You should know there are difficult choices when budgets are to be made. You face these constraints too. We should always be mindful of the burden that American taxpayers have and our obligation to deliver exceptional results on their behalf. This budget request will help us achieve our diplomatic goals in several ways. First, we'll make sure that China and Russia cannot gain a strategic advantage in an era of renewed great power competition. We'll continue our progress towards the final fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. And we'll support the people of Venezuela as they work toward a peaceful restoration of democracy and prosperity in their country. We'll also continue to confront the Islamic Republic of Iran's malign behavior, and will help our allies and partners become more secure and economically self-reliant. And I'll also make sure that our world-class diplomatic personnel have the resources they need to execute American diplomacy in the 21st century. I look forward to continue to work with each of you on these key foreign policy priorities and many more issues as well. I want to allow enough time for questions, so I'll keep these remarks short. And with that, I look forward to taking questions from you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and other members of your committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And there are so many questions, and I know our members are eager to have a conversation with you. Firstly, I want to say I really do appreciate the time you have spent with allies in the Middle East in an effort to strengthen our partnerships. However, I do have concerns regarding the direction of our policy under this administration. Let me start with an issue I've worked on during my entire career in Congress, Arab-Israeli peace. Do you support a resolution to this conflict that results in 2 states for 2 people living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition?
A year while I've been the Secretary, have the simple, realistic goal of providing a vision for the Israelis and the Palestinians to find their path forward. What that path will certainly be up to them. But we've been at this a long time, as you described. We've been at this decades to try and resolve this incredibly complicated issue. We think we have some ideas that are new and fresh and different, and we hope that those will appeal not only to the Israelis and the Palestinians, but to the larger set of threats that have prevented this conflict from being resolved over the past years and decades.
I appreciate your commitment, I appreciate your answer, and I do look forward to working with you, because I do remember being on the White House lawn when Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat were shaking hands. And the contours of any agreement have historically focused on borders, settlements, Jerusalem, refugees, and mutual recognition. Are these still the parameters around which you believe the two sides would return to the negotiating table?
I guess I'd say two things. First, those are the parameters that were largely at hand in the discussions before, and they led us to where we are today. No resolution. So we're hoping that we can actually broaden the aperture, that we can broaden this debate. The goal, it's a goal founded in the facts on the ground and a realistic assessment of what will get us a good outcome. How can we make the lives for the Palestinian people better? How can we do the same for the people of Israel? And how can we find a path forward so that this historic challenge that has presented conflict and risk throughout the Middle East for decades can be resolved?
I appreciate that answer, and I just want to make it very clear, given the demographics in the West Bank and Gaza, and given Israel's long-standing democratic principles, wouldn't you agree that a two-state solution is the best way for most people, for both people, to coexist peacefully and with dignity?
If you'll permit me to demur again, you'll see this administration's vision, and then ultimately it will be the peoples of those two lands that resolve this and make that decision about how it is they'll come together and what the contours of that resolution will look like. Our mission sets to help them with new ideas, fresh ideas, to create a real opportunity that we've not, America and others who have tried to resolve this, have not been able to do for years and years and years.
Thank you, and I know we'll be continuing that discussion. I want to address one other issue quickly, because by the end of fiscal year 2019, the United States will owe approximately $1.1 billion in arrears, roughly $750 million of which comes from fiscal year 2017, 18, 2019, and $328 million prior to fiscal year 2001. The failure of the United States to pay its bills have contributed to delayed payments to countries whose troops support peacekeeping forces, raising concerns about the sustainability of the UN peacekeeping system. And just 3 months ago, the United States supported the General Assembly's new scales of assessment, which slightly lowered the U.S. peacekeeping contribution to 27.89% for the next 3 years. Yet, the FY 2020 budget request would support a rate of only 16.2%. And this doesn't reach the assessment rate agreed upon in the 1990s, not to mention what the U.S. just agreed to. Why don't we make good on the agreements that we just made?
So, Madam Chairwoman, we're working our way through this. I've had a handful of discussions with Secretary General Guterres on this issue. It's the case that this administration is trying to get others to step up, particularly I think you mentioned with respect to UN peacekeeping costs, others to step up and share this burden. We think that's important. We've been working at this. We continue to work at this. The leadership at the UN acknowledges that there has been a historic imbalance with respect to how this has been done, and our efforts continue. We still pay far and away the largest share of those forces. We've done so for decades. We did so last year as well, and I'm confident we'll do so again this year.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Rogers, we're delighted to hear from you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, it was about 30 years ago that I led a delegation to Indonesia, and one of the stops we made was Bali. And we had a rare meeting with the man known as the Prince of Bali. Was known that way because he would have been the king of Bali had they not been absorbed into Indonesia. But a sage, a wise old head, he was probably at that time in his mid-80s. He was one of the founders of SEATO. And he agreed to meet with us, which was a rare occasion for him, in his compound, because he was worried about the presence of the United States in his region. We had a long talk over cigars after a wonderful meal. But he had the theory that China was out to assemble all of the country's peoples whom they deemed were Chinese descendants, which included Bali. Now we're seeing that prophecy come to life. The military preparedness that China has invested in the Pacific, Indo-Pacific, is overwhelming. They're able to bully many of these peaceful Asian countries with economic enslavement, with the, what's it called, the Belt and whatever, the economic investment that they make in a country and then jerk out that financing at a later time. What are we doing in Indo-Pacific to be sure that we protect the people like the Prince of Bali and all of the millions of people in that region from being dominated by the bully China?
So, Mr. Ranking Member, I think he was ahead of his time in recognizing this threat. And I think the United States and indeed the Western world didn't pay attention to this in the way that was necessary. We're hopeful our administration has made substantial steps in correcting that. You saw it in our national security strategy. We changed the way we think about China from a national security perspective. We all know the important economic relationships that the United States has with China, and we're happy to compete around the world with them when it's fair and transparent and under the rule of law. But the increasing risk that China poses to the United States and the West is real, and it is even more true in their backyard. And I hear that each time I travel throughout Asia or Southeast Asia. They want the United States there. And so we've put forward what we've called our Indo-Pacific strategy. It has a handful of components to it. Certainly one piece is the capacity of our military to be able to ensure that we have free and open navigation of waterways there. But there's also an enormous component that is diplomatic. It's America being present. It's us assisting our companies, ensuring that when there's a bid tender in Indonesia or in Vietnam or in Australia or Japan or South Korea, that this competition is fair and free, and that the Chinese showing up with debt diplomacy or worse yet, corruption, bribery, isn't something that drives the rule of law and transparency out of the way. We're committed to it. I'll be traveling to Asia, at least I plan to, twice here before the middle of the year to continue to work to develop this. We work through ASEAN as a central to this effort. The ASEAN nations are more aware of this risk today, and we also have the mission to make sure that we share with them our understanding of these threats and help them understand the facts as they really are.
Well, the Prince of Bali was concerned 30 years ago that we would vacate the region and leave them at the mercy of the Chinese. So the American presence there was what concerned him. And I heard this same story, you have as well, of course. Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, you name it, they have the exact same feeling toward China that I found on Bali. The military people tell me that this has to be a whole of government approach that we make in Indo-Pacific. That the State Department, USAID, all of the agencies of the federal government, including the military, must be present there in a unified, holistic approach to the problem. Do you agree with that?
I do.
I think it's important that we maintain that South China Sea presence that we have historically. I think that's very symbolic to the Asian people that we're there, and we intend to be there in defense of their freedom. So I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service and your travels. Welcome to your old home place here.
Thank you. One last thing to say, the legislation that you all passed last year, the BUILD Act, And now resourcing the BUILD Act will prove an important component of our efforts that you just talked about, the need that we have to ensure that countries understand that America is there and present and will continue to be so.
Good, thank you.
Ms. Meng.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you, Secretary Pompeo, for being with us today. I wanted to ask about refugee funding. Concerned that a 24% across-the-board cut is not only irresponsible but dangerous to our national security. As you know, there are currently more people who have been forcibly displaced than any other time in our history. 68.5 million, according to UNHCR. At least a whole generation of children have been born and will live their formative years in refugee camps. Since the president has dramatically reduced the role of the U.S. as an option for resettlement, the role of the U.S. government in this context has become increasingly political and diplomatic. I am concerned that decoupling refugee programming from the diplomatic efforts of the State Department by transitioning almost all MRA money to the International Humanitarian Assistance Bureau will reduce the effectiveness of U.S. diplomacy on refugee issues. How do you envision the balance between the diplomatic and development roles required in U.S. engagement on refugee issues?
I appreciate that question. There's a lively debate about how that ought to proceed. I've come to my conclusion. The State Department needs to be at the front of that, needs to be incredibly involved, and those need to be incredibly well connected so that we execute the policy on this appropriately, the U.S. policy on this appropriately. I'll say today, I believe that's happening. I'll give you an example from the last, what's today, Wednesday? Last 5 days, I was in Lebanon talking about approximately 1.5 million Syrian refugees that are in Lebanon today. The burden that places on Lebanon, the cost, the risk that presents to Lebanon and its democracy. And it was the State Department leading that discussion about how we can get the conditions right on the ground inside of Syria, how the United States and our Arab and Western partners can get the conditions right on the ground in Syria such that those refugees can return to their homes. And that's the mission set that the Lebanese people want. I frankly believe it's best for those individuals as well, but we've got to make sure that the conditions are right, and it's something that the United States Department of State will be at the front of.
I appreciate you saying that you're prioritizing it. I'm concerned that we will be able to do that if so much resources have been stripped from the State Department. Have duties of PRM already begun being transitioned to U.S. aid?
You know, I don't know the answer to, I want to make sure I give you an accurate answer to that. If I may get back to you, I'd prefer to do that.
Yes, that would be great.
It could be that, not in a significant way, but it could be that there's a handful of things that have happened that you might characterize that way. I want to make sure and give you a real picture of what it is we're actually doing.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My second question, I'll try to do this quickly. How does the State Department intend to target the critical issue of women's economic empowerment while cutting fundamental women's health and education programming? Concerned about, does this not ensure that WGDP will fail to be sustainable over a long time?
Well, we created it. And we intend to urge you all to fund it. I hope the next administration, whenever that comes, will continue to build on this as well. We believe this is an important program for women across the world. The whole team has been involved in this, the State Department, the White House with Ivanka Trump, DHS, DOD. It has been a whole-of-government approach from our administration to build this program out, to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place that's appropriate, and then to resource it in a way that meets not just enough money, but make sure that whatever money we have, we're able to use effectively to achieve the aims of the program.
Yeah, well, as you know, this is a bipartisan program and goal we share here in Congress. Over 100 countries placed restrictions on the types of jobs that women can hold. So this initiative's emphasis on eliminating these barriers to participation and creating more enabling environments is really a worthwhile one. So thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this important hearing. Mr. Secretary, good morning. Thank you. Nice to see you. First of all, let me commend you for taking diplomacy on the road, not just abroad, but here in America. It was great to see you in Iowa talking about the importance of diplomacy to America. I would have preferred that you had done that in Nebraska, but close enough.
Iowa and Kansas, I owe you one.
Okay.
Yes. All right.
It's the neighborhood, but again, great job. We really appreciated you coming out. Last summer, you convened a ministerial of foreign leaders to speak to the issue of religious pluralism and the respect for human dignity, the sacred space of conscience and the exercise of that right. Around the same time, at the behest of the Vice President, I traveled to northern Iraq along with Ambassador Sam Brownback as well as Mark Green, USAID Director, to look at the dynamics of how our substantive aid that had been shifted to help the religious minority communities there who have been so decimated by the genocide of ISIS, how that aid could be sustained. I came back from that experience with 3 words in my mind. It's possible, it's urgent, but it depends on security. You and I have had this conversation before, but I'd like to take just a few moments to unpack it a little bit more publicly. In response to that last piece, the security piece, I am very shortly, perhaps even today, introducing a Northern Iraq security resolution along with my good friend Anna Eshoo, Democrat from California. We've worked very closely with the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm hopeful that the United States Congress rallies around this concept of simply laying down a marker that urges, with international community help, the Iraqi central government and the Kurdish government to integrate Christians and Yazidis and other religious minorities, Islamic minorities, into the regularized security forces with some degree of authority to protect Nineveh and Sinjar. If we don't do this, all of this aid is not going to be sustainable. There are willing international partners. There are certain sensibilities to this all over the world, among the Iraqis, among the Kurds, other international partners, with you, with the Vice President's office, with the administration. So I'd like your response to this concept, again, of the United States just laying down a marker saying this is an important long-term strategy to restore the ancient tapestry of religious pluralism that used to thrive, particularly in northern Iraq as well as Baghdad, but has been so decimated. And without that, we're going to lose that rich tradition. There's going to be more pressure for out-migration. Can the Iraqis ever achieve peace without this fundamental concept of tolerance and the space for religious pluralism?
You and I have had a chance to talk about this. I'm happy that you raised it here this morning. The State Department and I can absolutely agree that this is a priority. I look forward to seeing the legislation. I haven't had a chance to see the legislation that you and Ms. Eshoo are going to present. We're happy to work with you to see how we can effectuate that. Our mission set has been pretty clear, to try and work with the Iraqi government to help them understand how important this is to get to the resolution, the political resolution of a free, independent, sovereign Iraq. It is central that every religious minority be respected, have their opportunity to have their voice heard. And so, yes, I think this is a priority. It's a priority for the individuals affected, the religious minorities affected. It's a priority for the people of Iraq, and certainly important for American values as well.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Secretary. I'm going to turn to you just recently traveled to the Middle East. I want to turn to the question of Egypt and our relationship there. The ranking member, Mr. Rogers, rightfully pointed out the importance of this relationship, and we're at the 40-year mark of a peace treaty that has held between Israel and Egypt. In 1979, I entered the Sinai Desert as a young man. And on this pile of twisted concrete and rubble, which sadly is so typical a scene now throughout the Middle East, were scrawled the words in spray paint, both in English and in Arabic. This had been the scene of the fighting in the '73 war. And it said, "Here was the war, here is the peace." That was a really important, formative moment for me. This peace treaty, which at times has been cold, but has it come at great sacrifice for both the Egyptians and the Israelis, brokered by the United States, is a template, a model. So Mr. Rogers, as well as your own, highlighting the importance of the relationship with Egypt, particularly in terms of the budget, to me is a very essential priority, because as we talk about potentially restoring Egypt's rightful place as a leader in the Arab world, without a strengthening of that relationship, and quickly, I'm afraid we may miss a critical moment here, but there again is possibility.
Thank you. I agree. If you saw on this trip to Middle East, I did not visit Egypt. I did on the previous one, where I gave some remarks in Cairo that talked about that very issue in language very similar to what you just described. There are challenges in Egypt. There are human rights challenges in Egypt. We don't shy away from talking about those. But that is an important strategic relationship. They are a linchpin of the Middle East, and they have been a good ally in the counterterrorism fight as well.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Appreciate it, and for your service. Let me just start by saying this. My concern for your budget proposal is not so much what's in it, but really the cuts that are being made, which some of my colleagues have pointed out. And Representative Lowey is a very kind person, and I think to call the budget inadequate is being very kind, because I'm going to just say I think it's embarrassing and dangerous. Okay, now, so I've had my cathartic moment, because I don't mean to be unkind. So I'm going to start with something hopefully we can agree with, and that is I'm going to make a general statement. When women succeed, the world succeeds. And so when women and girls are better educated, when they're healthier, when they're free from violence, not only are their families better off, but we find that their communities and their countries are has more prosperity, and it's more secure. Would you agree with that general proposition?
Yes, ma'am, wholeheartedly.
All right, good. So we're on the right track here. And then I also want to say this. I am very interested in your proposal on the economic empowerment, which I want to have you get into it more with the $100 million global fund. But I do want to follow up with Representative Mang's comments. And I want to say this because I really want you to take this to heart. I don't want to be mean-spirited, but I really hope you will take what some of us are saying and really think about this, because these cuts will undermine, some of these cuts on women's programs are going to undermine what you and what Ivanka Trump want to do in terms of get women more economic power. You're slashing international family planning programs on more than half. You're eliminating all assistance to the UN Population Fund, which makes efforts to end child marriage and genital mutilation and seeks to have healthy babies born. You're erasing the reproductive rights section from the annual Human Rights Report. You've been pushing to remove reference to sexual and reproductive health care at the annual UN Commission on the Status of Women. Yesterday, you expanded the inhumane global gag rule. I'm telling you, your administration is abortion obsessed. You're so obsessed with it that the side effects are devastating the health and are going to continue to devastate the health of women around the world. So before I get into that, let's just go back to some good news, I think, which is, could you explain exactly what this new program, the Women's Global Development Prosperity Program, is? And I would like to know whether you've had to take money from other gender-based programs to fund it.
No, so I appreciate the question. We've not had to do that. Okay. We may, I want to leave open the possibility we may conclude that there's a better way to use other resources to more effectively deliver what this program is designed to do. And if we do, we may make a decision to do that. We'll obviously ensure that Congress is fully informed and knows as we move money around. Look, the mission statement is really clear. When the President announced this in the Oval Office now a couple months back, it is to do precisely what you described. It is to find the methods by which we can create not only laws, but cultures in countries where women are empowered, women are free to work, to raise their families in the way that they want to, and have all the opportunities that we're counting on women be able to have here in the United States and have them all around the world. There'll be lots of streams to this program. If you saw the announcement, I think almost every cabinet, I think HHS was there, I think Commerce was there, State Department was present. There will be programs that will be rolled out. They're not fully fleshed out yet, to be sure, but will be rolled out all across the United States government to deliver against the primary objectives that the president set out that day. And I think he enunciated them pretty well, and there was wonderful bipartisan support thematically for those objectives.
Well, let's just say this, and I'm going to have I guess, a second round of questioning on some of the issues I brought up, but it is very important, really, and you agreed with me, that if you want women to be economically prosperous, they have to be healthy, correct? And I want to, again, stress that your budget and your actions by this administration is devastating the health of women around the world. And with that, I'm sorry to say that. Well, yeah, really, I am.
I'll say you suggested that you wouldn't be kind. You've been very kind. We just simply disagree on that point.
All right. Well, I'll kindly yield back to
Thank you.
the chair.
Thank you. Ms. Roby.
Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you, and I hope your family is well, and we appreciate your service to our country, and again, we're just really glad to have you here today. First, I want to thank you for the announcement that came out of the State Department yesterday. The Mexico City policy, which prohibits U.S. government funds from going to NGOs that perform abortions, was expanded to include NGOs that provide financial assistance to abortion providers. American tax dollars are not allowed to fund abortions in this country, and countries around the world should be no exception. I'm glad that the Trump administration has made the commitment to expand upon this Reagan-era rule, and I thank you for your leadership in protecting the unborn. In regard to the State Department's budget request, I too am glad to see that women's economic empowerment was made a priority. And so to build upon my colleagues, some of her statements, as you know, the State Department's request included $100 million for the new program in USAID called the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. And in my role as a member of Congress, I've had the privilege and have been fortunate enough to travel to several countries where many of which are seriously lacking in policies conducive to economic freedom for a woman and her ability to be financially independent. And so I wanted to ask you, and I know you just said that some of these programs are being developed as we speak, but in which countries do you foresee that we will be focusing these investments?
So we have not set out yet how we're going to prioritize, but if you, as a matter of logic, you can imagine these programs going in many places, certainly in countries throughout Africa, countries in the Middle East as well, places that just don't have a history of empowering women, allowing women to behave in the way that engage in activity in the way we know every human being has the right to be.
Well, I appreciate that. And of course, a lot of the work that I've been fortunate enough to be able to engage in is in Afghanistan. And whereas we've seen many gains for women, we also know how fragile it is as well. And so as you move forward in developing these programs, I hope that you will continue to make us aware of exactly what this looks like. We know that the success of women is a key indicator of the success of a country. And so I hope that you will keep us informed. The only other thing that I would build upon as it relates to this question is making sure that we have also mechanisms in place to ensure that the beneficiaries of these investments are held accountable. And so if you have any comments about that, I think some of the frustration in the past has been we make these investments in an attempt to offer opportunity, but then we're not able to measure, or we don't come back and measure real outcomes. And so if you want to just comment on that.
I'd welcome that opportunity. It is a very valid criticism, not only of programs that relate to women's empowerment, but of U.S. government, and I'll speak for the State Department programs as well, where U.S. taxpayers invest lots of money, and it is difficult to 5, 10 years later to identify the effectiveness of those resources. You see it in IG reports, you see it in internal workings at the State Department. More importantly, you see it in the world. You see this money and you see that relatively little change has been achieved. We're going to try in that program that you were referring to, the Global Women's Empowerment Program, but I and my team are trying in every program we have, whether it's foreign assistance or humanitarian assistance that we're providing, to ensure that when we do that, we have an objective. There are criteria, there are outcomes that are measurable, even if not always quantifiable, but measurable in a way that we can determine whether we achieved the goals that we set out to do. It is, there's nothing sadder than to look at a history of a program and see that you have asked the taxpayers for hundreds of millions of dollars over years and years and years, and the situation is no better or worse along the key criteria that were intended to be achieved.
I appreciate that very much, and I thank you again for being here today. And Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And before I turn to my colleague, Ms. Lee, I just want to make a very, very simple statement. Reference to this mysterious global abortion industry puts abortion politics at the center of every health program rather than advancing the effectiveness of programs that save lives. U.S. taxpayer dollars are not used to subsidize or promote abortions, period. I want to say that again. U.S. taxpayer dollars are not used to subsidize or promote abortions, period. Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. First, let me ask you about the HIV/AIDS accounts. Of course, you know, the United States, we've had longstanding bipartisan leadership on global health, especially on global HIV and AIDS epidemic. At the end of last year, we passed PEPFAR extension. It was legislation that I authored with Congressman Chris Smith, and President Trump signed it into law, and that was to reauthorize PEPFAR for 5 years. Additionally, Congressman Smith and I sponsored a bipartisan letter that was co-signed by 137 members in support of a strong United States contribution to the Global Fund's upcoming 6th replenishment conference. At the same time, we know that progress on preventing new infections is stagnant and that tens of millions of people will need sustained access to antiretroviral therapy over the next decade. A 2018 report by the Lancet Fund found stagnant or reduced funding coupled with a weakened global resolve to end the disease could result in a backsliding of our gains and allow the epidemic to rebound. The administration's 2020 budget request cuts PEPFAR budget by 29% and proposes a new structure for the Global Fund pledge that would change the maximum U.S. share from 33% to 25%. Now, public reports have indicated that the administration intends to implement this significantly lower match unless Congress mandates it. So this administration has put, of course, additional resources, which we are pleased about, into the domestic HIV epidemic, but you're stepping back now from our leadership on the global side. It's really robbing Peter to pay Paul. So, Mr. Secretary, given the significant needs that we know exist, how does the U.S. expect to maintain its longstanding leadership role in addressing global health challenges with these steep cuts, as well as why in the world would you make a decision to reformulate the 33% for the Global Fund, through which we have maintained through 8 Congresses and 3 administrations?
This administration is absolutely committed to the mission set that you've just described. It has been, to your point, it has been a bipartisan effort from certainly my time in Congress and through today. There is no nation, including in the most recent fiscal year and including in the fiscal year ahead, that has been as generous, that has asked their citizens to contribute as much to ending the scourge of AIDS in not only the United States, but around the world. We will continue to lead. We will continue to be part of this program. I get updates from our team constantly. I've seen what we think is the 2 and 5 and 10-year outlook. We think we've been effective. This is one of the programs. I was just talking with Ms. Roby. This is one of the programs where I think we can show demonstrable effectiveness for taxpayer dollars. And there comes a time in every program when you have to begin to think, you've been at this a long time, is there a way that you can deliver on this better? That's the objective that we have set out in our budget. Our aim, our mission, I think, is shared, but we are always having to make decisions about how to apply resources against the problem set. And that's what we did on this one as well.
Mr. Secretary, I think because of what you just said, we're making progress. Why would we pull back now and reduce our contribution to PEPFAR and the Global Fund when, in fact, the American people want us to succeed, and every report that we have shows that if we pull back, the infection rates will increase and we won't succeed?
We're going to succeed.
Mr. Secretary, with this type of a cut, we haven't seen any plan that would show that we're going to make sure that new infections don't emerge and that we're able to put this epidemic, get this epidemic under control. But hopefully we'll be able to go back to the drawing board on this. Also, let me just ask you about your 2020 budget, which proposes to cut bilateral aid to many of our key partners in Africa by at least 10%. This is after a well-documented track record of controversial statements, of course, from the president identifying certain countries as S-hole countries, and quite frankly, attitudes toward the continent generally. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The budget would cut bilateral assistance to Ghana by 56%, Ethiopia by 33%, Mozambique by 14%, a country which is facing a huge challenge in the wake of the cyclone that killed more than 1,000 people, South Sudan by 44%, South Africa by 71%, mostly in critical global health funds. Given these cuts, it's difficult to believe that the administration's Africa strategy is sound and even almost demonstrates that the president meant what he said when he identified countries as S-hole countries. So I'd like to hear why you made these cuts.
First of all, the predicate of your question is, in my judgment, fundamentally unsound. I'm deeply aware of the State Department's Africa strategy led by Timur Naj, a wonderful officer in our department. We have relooked not only Africa, but every country in terms of evaluating where we can most effectively achieve the United States interests. This is what we're using taxpayer dollars. It is America that we are tasked with keeping secure and safe. And you have to make decisions. You have to demonstrate priorities. You have to ask your partners to step up. You have to ask your bilateral recipients of this aid. They have to step up and demonstrate that they're using your dollars and resources in the ways that you'd intended them to do. They have to take on economic challenges and security challenges in their own country and get the politics right in their nation. And we have evaluated each of these criteria, both inside of their countries and how it fits inside the American strategic security objectives. And we're reallocating foreign assistance in that way. It's that straightforward.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr.
Yes,
Secretary.
ma'am. Thank you.
Come back. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Glad to have you with us. I want to return to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the guiding schools of thought on all sides, I think, for years has been the need for the U.S. to facilitate direct negotiations between the two parties. And in fact, you acknowledged that this morning in your answer to Ms. Lowey. So now, outside the framework of any negotiations, outside the framework of any anticipated final status agreement, this administration has made a series of moves. One, you moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem unilaterally, apart from the kind of broader agreement previous administrations have sought. Two, you closed the Palestinian embassy in Washington, D.C. Three, you shut down the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, the main U.S. eyes and ears on the ground in the West Bank and the main interlocutor for communicating with the Palestinians. Four, you cut off all U.S. contributions to UNRWA, closing schools in Gaza and exacerbating the severe humanitarian crisis there. 5, you cut off all assistance to the West Bank, even assistance going through American-led implementing partners on the ground for things like food security, education for children with autism. I have an explicit example of that from some people working with a school in Bethlehem on that autism challenge. Water treatments, oncology medicine, as well as programs that bring Israelis and Palestinians together for dialogue and conflict mitigation. Now, you're about to unveil a long-awaited peace agreement that you have drafted, no doubt with demands to follow, that the Palestinians be grateful for that plan and regard the U.S. as a fair-minded arbiter who respects their aspirations. Can you tell me how this is supposed to work? Am I missing something?
Yes. Yes, you are.
Well, please tell me.
You're missing the history. Those things that you identified, the recognition of Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel, the homeland for the Jewish people, the decision to take the Israeli sovereignty, to recognize Israeli sovereignty, those are all things that are different. What went before didn't work. I think you'd have to acknowledge that. Decades of trying the old way failed to resolve this conflict. It just.
So the idea
I've met with each of the, if I may, just one more moment. I've met with each of the individuals who have been involved with this at different times, over different times in my life. I've talked to them about the complexity of the situation, and to a person, they would acknowledge that the efforts that they made, the theories that they used, the strategy they developed, failed to achieve the outcome that I think you and I share.
So you're satisfied that this administration has reached out effectively to the Palestinians and has assured them of your good faith and your goodwill, and that the Palestinian reaction to this is somehow off base.
Our vision will demonstrate our commitment that we want Palestinians to have a better life as well. And I personally have had a number of interactions during my time in the executive branch with the leadership inside of the West Bank. I hope they will view us as a fair arbiter. We want a better outcome for both Israel and the people living in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as well.
What does closing their embassy in Washington have to do with being a fair arbiter, or closing, I think equally serious, is closing that consulate in Jerusalem? That basically cuts off diplomatic ties in both directions. And when the Hope Flowers School has an autism program that this country has supported and that many people are invested in, and all of a sudden that funding's removed, when you have to pave over an infrastructure project in Jericho because the money's running out, is that demonstrating the kind of and you know, in the case of Venezuela, you've been very persuasive about the need to show empathy and support for ordinary people. I don't know how that lesson is lost. It appears to me, honestly, Mr. Secretary, that it has been lost on the Palestinian community.
I appreciate your view. It's different from mine. I was just in that space. I was just at the facility that you referred to. Our connectivity, the people at the State Department that have worked on this issue in the West Bank for years are continuing to work on it.
So how do you assess the Palestinian response to closing their embassy and closing our consulate and cutting off all this aid, freezing the aid and then cutting it off? They're somehow supposed to be grateful for this?
What we're aiming to do is resolve a decades-long conflict.
And this is the path forward, you're confident, to totally marginalize and alienate the Palestinian side?
I'm very confident that what was tried before failed, and I'm optimistic that what we're doing will give us a better likelihood that we'll achieve the outcomes that will be better for both the people of Israel and the Palestinian people as well.
Well, we certainly share that objective, and we will await the response on all sides to your peace plan, and also hope for a very measured response if that plan is criticized from the Palestinian side, as surely one can anticipate it will be.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, before I turn to Ms. Torres, just following up on Mr. Price, when should we expect the Jared Kushner peace plan that has been talked about and worked on, and as someone similar to Mr. Price, who's worked on this issue for my whole career, I hope we don't have to wait another 20 years. Could you tell us when we will see the Jared Kushner peace plan?
Yes, ma'am. I think we can say in less than 20 years.
How about being more precise?
I just prefer not to be more precise. I'm very hopeful that we'll present our vision before too long. I'm not trying to evade. I don't know precisely when and how it is we'll present this. We've been working on it a while. We want to make sure we have it as complete and as effective, as good as we know how to do. When we get there, we'll unveil it.
Well, shall we say many of us are cautiously optimistic that we can see some kind of a breakthrough. And as I mentioned before, I do remember sitting on that White House lawn when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin were shaking hands. So I'd like to join you on that lawn again, or any place you suggest.
Yes, ma'am. I would love to be there with you as well.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your attendance and for that quick laugh. As the founder and co-chair of the Central America Caucus, I have been very focused on addressing the root causes of migration from that region. Providing foreign assistance is an important part of the answer, but it simply isn't enough. And if we're going to make progress on the very tough issues that this region is facing, corruption, gang violence, and poverty, severe poverty, we need a comprehensive approach. And I know that you agree with that. For one, we urgently need an ambassador to Honduras, preferably someone with diplomatic experience and expertise in the region. We also need high-level engagement, regular meetings with the region's leaders to make sure that they are making progress on their commitments under the Alliance for Prosperity. And sometimes we need to take tough actions when these leaders do things that are contrary to our mutually agreed goals for the region. So I was surprised to see that on September 1, 2018, the day after Guatemalan officials decided to misuse J8 Jeeps that the U.S. donated to them for the purpose of counter-narcotic efforts at the border of Mexico. They utilized these vehicles in an effort to intimidate our U.S. embassy diplomats. And I was surprised to see that on September 1st, a tweet from your account stating that our relationship with Guatemala is important, and we greatly appreciate Guatemala's effort in counter-narcotics and security. Now, your budget request includes $256.3 million for the Central America Regional Security Initiative. Combating corruption in the Northern Triangle has been a major priority for the U.S. strategy for engagement in Central America. Can you tell me, how does your budget request prioritize the fight against corruption in the Northern Triangle?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Thanks for your attention to this important place that, frankly, I think doesn't get the focus that it needs. That you see the challenges at our southern border. You see challenges more broadly, not only in Mexico, but in South America that result from ineffective governments in the Northern Triangle countries and in Central America. So not only the State Department, but other elements of the United States government, DHS, DEA, and others are all focused on taking the RSI, the Regional Security Initiative, and delivering against it. I think Secretary Nielsen's actually down in the region today. I think she was flying, I think it was to Honduras today, to work on a number of issues that surround borders there and security there and political stability there. My team will join her in many of those meetings. Our priority really is to find the leaders in that region that are prepared to do the things, the difficult things that haven't been done for an awfully long time under different administrations in the United States as well, and convince them that getting more stable, more democratic outcomes there can truly benefit the people of their country and lead to stability in the region. We know we have a role where we can assist them from a security perspective in countering transnational criminal organizations that are moving people and drugs out of there into the United States through multiple methods. And we're committed to doing that. And we think we've got this resourced in a way that is reasonable. And as President Trump has made clear, we're going to reinforce success. Where we see progress, where we see good programs, effective leadership, we will continue to ensure that we apply resources against them.
I agree that we need to encourage them, but at the same time, we don't need to encourage bad behavior, especially when they try to intimidate our diplomats in that region. I think that that was a slap in the face to us as Americans, and I think that we should have responded accordingly by removing those vehicles and not rewarding them by giving them 4 additional vehicles after that incident occurred. How are we going to deal, with these presidents that are refusing to hold themselves accountable and to allow the attorney generals to investigate massive corruption in the region?
Well, we've seen challenges on all sides in each of these countries, both from the leaders and sometimes from the investigators too. The UN has a role. You're probably referring to CSIC in Guatemala as well, and their role. You saw decisions we've made where we didn't see the transparency, the rule of law from those folks in the way we needed to see that too. Look, it's difficult, and you know this as well as I do. We're trying to find those who are prepared to set up truly transparent rule of law, democratic institutions, and support them.
My time
we hope
is
their
up,
people
sir.
in the country will support them as well. And you should know too, I take it as a priority to make sure and protect my diplomats and the officers that work under Chief of Mission Control, even those that aren't State Department officials, to ensure that we do right by them every day. I think we did that there in Guatemala as well.
I sent you my questions and concerns ahead of time, and I hope to be able to continue that dialogue in the next round. Thank you.
We're going to go around for another round, and I appreciate your time. Keep thinking you should be on a plane someplace.
I'm happy to be
Isn't it nice
sitting
to
right
be
here.
That's
Exactly.
right.
Yes, ma'am.
This is an issue I have been concerned about for a very long time. So it's not just you and this administration. The Russian government is engaged in a concerted effort to undermine democracy, weaken multilateral institutions, including NATO, and reverse economic independence and prosperity in Europe and Eurasia. I am extremely concerned about increased corruption, democratic backsliding in the region. The FY 2020 request would cut assistance to the region by approximately 55%. I'm sure that cut would turn things around, but that's something we could discuss. What message does this send to Russia and our allies and partners about U.S. resolve? What is the State Department doing to counter the malign influence of Russia in Europe and Eurasia, including through support to civil society, human rights, and the rule of law? Does the State Department have a counter-Kremlin strategy similar to that of U.S. aid? Tell us about your view of what Voice of America is doing, what the BBG is doing. They have a budget of about $800 million, if I'm correct, and $250 million is for Voice of America. Are we just watching the change in Europe and the anti-American, anti-U.S. clearly observations, or is there something that we are doing to counter this?
Boy, a handful of questions there. Let me just talk about what we're doing, and then you can guide me to what you'd prefer I talk about. The threat you identify is real. It is the case that Russia has interfered in elections here in the United States. It's going to try and interfere with one in Ukraine in the week and a half or so that's left and the weeks that are left before government formation. But they're not the only country. There's lots of countries. China's done similar things. Iran has done similar things as well. But with respect to Russia, I think we have demonstrated our commitment, and I think Vladimir Putin gets that. I think we've demonstrated our commitment to pushing back against the threats that he poses to Europe and the West. I can cite a long litany, not only the sanctions that exceed what any other administration has done, not only the kicking out of 60 Russian spies from the United States, The increase in the United States defense budget is certainly not something that the Russian leadership can be happy about. The fact that we're exporting crude oil and natural gas all around the world, competing with Russian crude and natural gas, is something I can tell you the Russians are deeply concerned about. The list goes on with respect to the seriousness we have taken, the risk that this presents to the United States, and we've done so all the while trying to find places, and I did so as CI director as well, trying to find places where we can find a shared overlapping set of interests with Russia so that we can get better outcomes. If we can get to a better outcome in Syria by talking and working with them, if we can find ways to ensure that Americans who are flying on aircraft traveling around the world aren't harmed by Chechens out of Russia and the surrounding region, those are good things, and things that administration has it's not only a good thing that we're dealing with the Russians on them, it's necessary and proper.
I think it's still in existence, the Global Engagement Center.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Do they do anything?
Yes, they do.
Tell us
Let me talk about broadly. You mentioned both the BBG and the Voice of America. I'd put the Global Engagement.
Voice of America is really part of the
right.
BBG.
And then I'd mention the Global Engagement Center, each of which has a mission of overt communications, talking about sharing, spreading American values, countering propaganda that comes from all across the world. The Global Engagement Center, we now have Leah Gabriel on board leading the charge. She has a couple of primary missions. Russian is one of those primary missions and we're happy to give you a briefing on what she's doing and what our team at the Global Engagement Center is doing. We think this will be important. You all have funded this quite well, and we appreciate that. I want to come back, though, to the BBG. It's a challenge. It still has a leadership challenge because we all know the history of the BBG board and how it came to be fractious and had become political. We still have not resolved that situation. And I would urge to get a CEO that organization in place so that the BBG will have the right leadership so that it can do the traditional mission, perhaps in a different information environment than we did back in the Cold War, but can perform its function in a way that is important and noble and reflects the enormous resources that that American taxpayers have put towards that. I'm very concerned about it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I would like to schedule a briefing. This is an issue I've been working on for a long time. I'm not blaming just this administration. I have met with many people. At one point, we were off in L.A., and we thought the movie industry could give us some advice and spread our message of democracy and hope and freedom. But frankly, I think it's just getting worse.
Yes, ma'am. I'd be happy to have Ms. Gabriel come speak with you or your staff or however you think that would be appropriate.
I would like to do it and invite as many other members who are interested.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Secretary, as you know, some 3.5 million Venezuelans have fled their country. And of those, more than 1 million have gone to Colombia. And I'm worried about what effect the Venezuelan problem is going to have on the whole region. Is your budget request sufficient, do you think, to manage the humanitarian needs and the other challenges spilling over from Venezuela?
It's a fair question. I think were things to say about where they are today, I think the resources are likely sufficient. But I think the best analysis is there'll be another 2 million refugees from Venezuela, or displaced persons from Venezuela. They'll go somewhere, many to Colombia, some to Brazil, some to other nations in the region. It could be that we'll come back and say we need additional assistance to address that need. We're trying to resolve that, right? We're trying to work with the Venezuelan people to ensure that Maduro leaves and we can begin to create the conditions. And this will be, just so we're all eyes wide open, this will be a years-long undertaking to provide the assistance in Venezuela to get the Venezuelan people back on their feet. The decimation that has taken place long before U.S. sanctions. Right? We are now years and years into the Maduro decimation of this country. But we think we've got the resource level about right today. I do worry. Along that border, along that Colombian-Venezuelan border, ELN, FARC are using this uncertainty, this movement of peoples, this movement of goods and narcotics across that region to rebuild and strengthen. So that's not just a State Department function. There are other elements of the USG that will have a role in that. But I do worry about the increased risk from the FARC and from ELN in that region as a result of the chaos that Maduro has created.
Well, finally, we've gotten the new president in Colombia on the right track in returning to aerial eradication of coca, and we obviously support him heavily in that effort. Yet I worry that any progress we've made with the new government on counter-narcotics could be jeopardized by the chaos next door in Venezuela. What do you think about the effect of the counter-narcotics effort?
So we're concerned about it, and President Duque is concerned about it too. He shared that with President Trump when he visited here, and he shared it with me when I was in Colombia now a couple months back. He's concerned about that as well. I guess there's three things to say. One, it's why the urgency to resolve the situation in Venezuela is so strong. Second, it's why we have to continue to support President Duque and Colombia in their efforts, these counter-narcotics efforts, which have truly, I don't know the most recent numbers from the past weeks, but over the past years have escalated dramatically. Much of that has moved here the United States. And then finally, it's why the work that the State Department's done to build out this coalition, the OAS has been spectacular on the issues in Venezuela. The Lima Group, which largely South American-led, but America's been an important partner in ensuring that the Lima Group gets this set of issues right. We need to continue to work with our friends and allies in the region to deliver better outcomes for Colombia. The risk that this issue of coca gets away from us is very real.
Quickly on another topic. We have significant work ahead of us to counter Chinese espionage and technology theft. It will require extensive cooperation with our European and other allies like Japan and South Korea. I believe this will require deepened intelligence sharing and stricter review of foreign direct investment, export controls, communications procurement policy. Are we on the same page as the European Union is now regarding China?
So it's mixed, to be sure. The State Department has led a U.S. government-wide effort to share what we know, the threats as we see them, to make sure that not just France and Britain and Germany, but every country all throughout Europe understands the risks as we see them, and to provide our best wisdom on how to prevent those risks, the security risks that are presented. There are deep commercial issues here as well. Big telecom providers find it lucrative to deal with Chinese businesses and put Huawei or ZTE equipment inside their infrastructure and networks. We've done our best to share with those businesses and the countries in which they reside the threat that we see from engaging in that. Some of them simply have come to believe that they can mitigate these risks in ways that we just don't believe are possible. When you have telecommunications that are deeply connected to state-owned enterprises inside of China, we don't see that there is a technical mitigation risk that is possible. And we've communicated to them, and we are very hopeful that the Europeans will begin to move further in our direction in their understanding of those risks.
Well, a close American ally, Italy, has signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And apparently China is making a big push into the European Union, seeing that it's individualized rather than a massive unified place, which is open country for them, China. Do you think that we can finally get the EU to stand up tall against China?
I think we've made progress, and I know that we're going to continue to push.
Good enough. Thank you.
Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Along the line of reasoning that Ranking Member Rogers just said, Mr. Secretary, your agency and USAID, we give about $25 billion a year in humanitarian assistance, poverty, anti-poverty programs, global health. How much does China give? It's a hypothetical. I don't mean to put you on the spot.
A very, very small number.
So one of the largest
economies. A tiny fraction of this.
Okay. So one of the largest economies of the world that has been progressing through our trade relations, through trade relations with the other, takes minimal or no responsibility for the world's development well-being. The point here is, I think the world is rapidly catching on that they're predatory lenders without taking full responsibility for the broader ideals of a development, of an ecosystem of development. And in that regard, I'm going to weave a little tale here. I want to follow up on Ms. Torres's comments. We're trying, our immigration debate is one that is obviously complex and difficult, but part of the solution is to move it off the 1 yard line and to get back upstream into the countries where there is significant pressure, either because of unrest, crime, or just economic need for people to leave. And so several years ago, we shifted a number of funds to the Northern Triangle to try to work constructively on systems of justice and systematic economic reforms to create the conditions in which people can thrive there, which is a part of our broader immigration policy, and I agree with this. You mentioned the BUILD Act, though, tying back to the proper ecosystem for development. China runs around the world building large infrastructure projects with their own labor, taxing the internal resources of countries, particularly in Africa, leaving large debt behind in those countries. We're running around the world trying to help people who are sick, trying to attack the structures of poverty, trying to create food security, and the types of micro-development assistance which lead to long-term stability and just government, just economic outcomes and just governance. The BUILD Act is hopefully an attempt for us to recreate and reimagine what development assistance ought to be, because we've got our own problems, frankly, with fragmentation. So could it be one of the pathways, particularly in the Northern Triangle, in which we think about the ecosystem of development more creatively, rather than just a large terminal or a large road and calling it development, but how we get underneath the structures of the deep wounds and structures of poverty and assist economically, but also assist with stability so that people can have flourishing lives where they live.
Yes, I believe that the model, the BUILD Act model.
Is it a significant pathway for that kind of reform?
It is significantly different than the way we've done before in multiple dimensions, not the least of which is involves the private sector as well. We've watched other countries tie their government to their private sector in ways that we would never do, and we're proud that we have this separation in the United States. I'm not suggesting for a moment we should behave the way they do with their government state-owned enterprises. But being connected, having understanding, having American values talked about explicitly in the way we engage in the world, I think is incredibly important. I think the BUILD Act is a very good model for that.
Sometimes the market doesn't function properly, and
right.
It needs capital assistance from public sources to actually springboard into viable partnerships with the private sector, who should be virtuously committed to, again, the long-term ecosystem of proper economic well-being and development. And I think this is getting us there. I do see it as one pathway for reform of the fragmentation that we have. The ideal of, again, correcting market failure, but leveraging the best of the market and private outcomes so that there is continuity and sustainability of the initial aid. Sometimes we do the right thing by trying to build out a school, but when our soldiers or troops leave, it reverts back to what it was. It's not sustainable. So anyway, I'm sorry for the speech here, but I'm trying to immerse myself in this space, and I actually need to talk to you, Ms. Lowey, about this. We want to convene a mapping strategy with key principles in this area, all the way from the World Food Program to the World Bank to the International Agricultural Fund and others.
The IMF, others who are involved in these financing relations.
To try to rethink whether or not we are overlapping, we're too fragmented, and more creative, imaginative ways to approach a whole variety of poverty assistance programs worldwide.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, I asked you earlier about countries in Africa and the deep cuts that are being made by this budget. Now I'd like to ask you about the cuts proposed for the Western Hemisphere, which I believe you proposed about 1/3 of the U.S. assistance to Western Hemisphere countries be cut. Again, these countries include countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We know the very real challenges that the region faces, from the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and the migration challenges it has created in the region, to the recent civil unrest in Haiti, to the vulnerability of countries in the Caribbean. So these significant cuts, which cut across the board in your proposed budget for the Western Hemisphere, appear to be at odds, quite frankly, with the State Department's own policy to promote economic growth and prosperity and democratic governance. I'm sure you know that China, and I know these countries very well, China is filling the void in many ways that have historically been neglected by the United States. In addition, I'm concerned that your budget, again, you're pulling PEPFAR funding from several countries in the Caribbean, and its intent to your intent to not continue such policies. It's already done this in countries like Haiti, where only 35% of 30,000 people living with HIV were accessing retroviral therapy. So I would think we'd go in the opposite direction and try to help these countries in terms of economic growth, in terms of development assistance, and given the geopolitical issues that our country has with China, I would think that we would see what China is engaged in the Caribbean countries, and really, in many ways, send a signal that we too care about this region. My second question, and I'll just ask you very quickly with regard to Cuba, I want to know what impact has the reduction of staff at the U.S. Embassy had in Havana on the embassy operations, and I'd like to know the status of the 26 members of the U.S. Embassy community stationed in Havana in terms of the health injuries, including hearing and loss and cognitive issues. What's the status of the investigation into these unexplained health injuries? We've been following this very closely, and there seems to be no conclusion yet, and yet the efforts toward at least people-to-people exchanges and moving towards some semblance of private sector and people involvement in Cuba has been stopped, and the health issues have been used as the rationale for beginning to pull out, quite frankly.
Let me try and take your first question, at least in part. You began by talking about Chinese import, or Chinese influence in the Caribbean region. It's real. It's an attempt to undermine Western democracy, Western values in those countries. We are the first administration to actually take this issue seriously, and these issues long predate this administration. We've confronted. You can look at State Department demarches. You can look at our State Department mission statement. You can look at the priorities that I set out when I had ambassadors from all across that region in the world into the State Department in January of this year. We understand and are directing our foreign assistance directly aimed at competing every place that China is trying to compete. It is a fact that we will never show up with as much money as China is going to show up with. That will never be the basis of the competition. If it is, we will fail.
Secretary, I'm not asking us to show up with as much money. I'm asking us, why are we cutting where we've never really invested?
We're going to make sure. I agree. The previous administration failed to invest there. I'll concede that. We are very focused on this issue. I want to save a bit of time to talk about the very important issues you raised in your second question, if I may. I was and remained very concerned about those who have suffered health incidents in Cuba. We have expended enormous resources. We, more broadly than just the State Department, have expended enormous resources to identify the cause of this issue, and importantly, to take care of the broadly defined needs of those who have been injured by these health attacks. We have not been able to resolve this yet. Some of the best minds, not just in government, but across the global medical system, have not yet been able to identify and connect up so that we can find the cause, so that we can go attack the problem set. It has proven incredibly vexing. I continue to worry for the officers that we have there. We have unclassified. We are doing all that we can to make sure that they do not suffer health incidents as well. We have a reduced staff there as a result of this. And it absolutely reduces our capacity to perform our diplomatic function there. We've asked the Cuban government to help us. They've done nothing to help us identify the cause of this. They say they had nothing to do with it. In some cases, they've suggested we're making it up or it's not real. My deputy, John Sullivan, runs a health incident task force that meets each and every week to talk about the status of every dimension of this, how we're keeping our current officers safe. Do we have the right staffing level? Have we provided the resources to assist those who have been injured? Are we doing the right thing to protect not only ours, but other Americans that travel to the country? We are incredibly focused on this issue, but it remains a real concern.
Thank you. Mr. Price. Oh, Ms. Mang is next.
Wanted to ask about Iran and Syria. Obviously, we've seen over the last several years of the conflict in Syria, Iran has managed to entrench itself deeply within Syrian territory. What more can the United States do to stem Iran's involvement in Syria? And in talking about the U.S. retreating, how will the retreat from Syria affect Iran's presence?
Well, we're not retreating, and had the previous administration not refused to take any action that might have upset the apple cart with respect to the JCPOA, we would not have the problem today, not only with Iran and Syria, but the Iran support of the Houthis in Yemen, Iran's running militias inside of Iraq, Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. The list goes on. When we took office, Iran was on the march. We've done a number of things to try and turn that around. First of all, we acknowledge that the permanent pathway to a nuclear weapon that was the JCPOA made no sense for the United States of America. Second, we've put on historic sanctions, which are having an impact. I don't know if you all saw the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, now it's probably been 6, 8, 10 days ago, rattling his tin cup around the world, begging for money. That's a good thing. When Hezbollah can't pay its soldiers, when its people in the field are dying, that's a good thing for freedom and stability in the Middle East. We are working with allies and partners. We convened 60-plus nations in Warsaw to talk about the threat from Islamic Republic of Iran. We had Israel and Arabs working together to find ways to resolve this threat that the Islamic Republic of Iran presents to the Middle East and to the world. We are incredibly focused on it. We are going to stay at it. And I am confident that the Iranian people will be the ultimate beneficiaries of the work we're doing. I am confident the Iranian people will get what they so richly deserve. This is a nation with a rich history, a highly educated population, and a country that deserves better than the kleptocracy that is the Khamenei regime.
Thank you. President Trump, your president, has been very clear in wanting to retreat. So, I was just confused, and thank you for clarifying.
You're just wrong about that.
When the president was very clear in wanting to retreat.
I'm happy to respond to that if you'd like. I mean, that's just untrue.
We can pull video clips, but my next question, if I could finish,
I'd like to give me just 30 seconds.
If I could finish my question, because
Yes,
I'm running out of time. Yes, in talking about rebuilding Syria, how are we ensuring that rebuilding efforts aren't benefiting Assad or Iran? What kind of messaging are we delivering to entities who are wanting to participate?
So it's a good question. Let me answer your previous comments as well. So we have, along with the Europeans, made very clear that we will not provide reconstruction dollars to areas that are under the control of the Assad regime, and that we're supporting Gary Peterson in his UN efforts to implement UN Resolution 2254. Ambassador Jeffries is hard at work at that every day to get a political resolution inside of Syria as a precondition to U.S. dollars, frankly, European dollars too, and we're hopeful the Arab countries will agree. It makes no sense when Assad is in control to begin to do rebuilding. We'll still do humanitarian assistance in certain places where there's desperation, but it's our full intention to get the political resolution. And I want to pivot to talking about our strategy. It's not retreat. Indeed, the previous administration invited the Russians into Syria. I mean, it's just a fact. This administration took down the caliphate along with great partners. We developed a Defeat ISIS coalition of some 80 countries that took down the last inch of real estate owned by ISIS. The threat from radical Islamic terrorism remains. It's not going away. It's in West Africa. It's in Asia. It's in lots of places. It remains in the Middle East. We are determined to do this. We will move force levels. Sometimes we'll increase. Sometimes we'll decrease. But to describe what this administration has done, the complete destruction of the caliphate, where you remember the pictures, people in cages, heads cut off on beaches, we took that down. To describe that as retreat is just not an accurate description.
I'm just repeating what I've seen in the media, and we can have a whole other discussion on Iran and Syria and the support of Russia under this administration as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Let's return to the Northern Triangle. This is a critical issue, I think, that needs serious attention. When we see people fleeing their home countries, women, children, families fleeing violence and corruption, we naturally look to the humanitarian conditions, the economic conditions in their home countries. What's driving the migration? Now, in the previous administration, late in the previous administration, with the support of Congress, and as you know, General Kelly, then at Southern Command, played a critical role in this, the U.S. Greatly increased assistance to Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. You also know that consistently now, 3 budgets in a row, the Trump administration has proposed to cut this assistance by something like 30%. Now the president has actually publicly threatened to cut all assistance to the Northern Triangle, essentially as punishment for the ongoing outmigration that we need to figure out how to mitigate. Let me just quote the tweet. This is from the president. Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are doing nothing for the United States but taking our money. Word is that a new caravan is forming in Honduras, and they are doing nothing about it. We will be cutting off all aid to these 3 countries, taking advantage of the U.S. For years. Now we have a news report saying that the funding that we have voted, and as you know, the Congress has largely restored the funding that the president wanted to cut in the intervening years. But that money now is sitting there undistributed. This is quoting one of your State Department officials. We have paralysis moving this funding through the Northern Triangle because people don't know what the president wants, one State Department official said. That's a quote. In quoting, no one wants to do something. Do you have the name of that person? No one wants to do something that looks like they're not following his guidance. It's being slow-walked. The paperwork impasse threatens to undermine efforts to address the root causes of migration from the region, the official added. Okay, what can you say about that? We have had in the past bipartisan agreement that these root causes need to be addressed. The president apparently doesn't think that way, and now the aid that we've voted is being held up. I mean, is there anything inaccurate about these reports? What is U.S. policy? I guess that's the basic question that comes through all this.
I'm happy to take the basic question. I must say I would strongly prefer that we all avoid using unnamed sources from the media to make arguments. I just think that's not constructive. I'll always talk about the things we're doing in the places I can identify.
Since you make a point of it, yeah. You know, it's very common practice to have officials quoted in that way. Now, maybe your official was out of line, but is your official who's quoted here, is that incorrect?
Let me talk to you. I'm happy to talk about the policy. President Trump has made very clear that we're going to make sure that U.S. taxpayer dollars achieve the outcomes. It's not enough to talk about them. It's not enough to feel good about them. It's not enough to be able to show how much money we spent. Indeed, none of those are metrics that deliver. You talked about all the money that's been spent over the past years, previous administration and the first couple years of this one. And you then said, we still have an enormous problem. That's proof of its own that this has not been effective. And so our mission, the mission President Trump has given to me, Secretary Nielsen, as we're trying to address these sets of issues, is develop a set of programs that reward effective outcomes, that reward good leadership, that get us to a place where we actually achieve the outcomes. This is about reality, not feeling good that we spent money. It's about delivering on these programs. It has proven vexing for both that administration and this one to stand up effective governance. To your point on, you made a mention of caravans. We have people coming across the border today from these countries in numbers and in groups. It was onesies and twosies, mostly single males. That has now changed dramatically. It's now families coming across in significant numbers in the dozens and dozens. I think this is evidence that the policies that we had before have not been effective. And so we are trying to take the money that you have appropriated and the taxpayers have graciously provided to actually achieve important outcomes for the United States. That's the president's policy.
Well, we would certainly welcome some indication of what that policy consists of. You know, you seem to be saying, let me check you on this. You seem to be saying that because this is a vexing problem, because we have not solved it and that our efforts to solve it have proved very, very challenging and very, very difficult, that therefore the rational response is to become punitive about these countries, to cut off aid entirely, or to hold up the aid that has been approved and what your official says, seek clarification. That's what we're seeking this morning, clarification. What's going on?
Yeah, I hope I didn't use the word punitive. I didn't intend.
Well,
I may have misspoken.
You don't think the tweet is punitive? The quote.
I think our policy is aimed at getting an effective outcome, and that's what we're trying to achieve. We're making very clear to the leaders of those governments, not just their presidents, not just their most senior leaders. We're making clear throughout their immigration teams, their security teams, their economic teams, that we have expectations for how their behavior must change in order to continue to maintain U.S. taxpayer support. That seems eminently reasonable.
Word is that a new caravan is forming in Honduras, and they are doing nothing about it. We will be cutting off all aid to these three countries, taking advantage of the U.S. for years. That does not, you would not define that as a punitive statement.
I'm not going to comment on my evaluation. You asked me about the U.S. policy, and I've done my level best to articulate it for you this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I do want to express my appreciation to you, Mr. Price, for referencing that aid. In fact, I have been very concerned for a while, having been part of Vice President Biden's task force, and I remember it very clearly. I cannot say we were successful, but I don't think we can give up, and I look forward to continuing the discussion, Mr. Price, and with you, Mr. Secretary, about what more can we do to deal with the root causes, because these root causes and the effect of these causes directly impact what is happening at our border. So I do hope Mr. Price and this committee can work with you and see if these programs can be more successful in making root causes changes more successful in those regions of origin. So I thank you, for Mr. Price, for referencing it. Ms. Frankel, thank you.
Chair. Mr. Secretary, you and I think we're getting along very well right now. Because we did agree that when you educate girls and women and they're healthier, it's better for the world. Let me find something else we can agree on. It is wrong to torture, to rape women who are merely protesting for their human rights. Would that be wrong?
I want to make sure I don't get a double negative. That would be wrong.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. There we go. We've agreed on something else. But seriously, I want to ask you about what's going on to some of the women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia. We know that there are many who were protesting for the end of the ban on women driving and for abolishing the male guardianship system, that they have been thrown into prison where they are being subject to torture, rape, electric shock, sleep deprivation, really no justice occurring there. And I would like to know what, if any, interaction the State Department has had to try to alleviate this situation.
Yes, ma'am. We've had interactions at, I think, nearly every level. about specific cases that we're aware of, as well more generally the policies that we have every hope and expectation that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will engage in. When I say nearly every level, I've had this conversation with the most senior leaders, including the King and the Crown Prince and my counterpart, the Foreign Minister. I know my team has had similar ones. I know our team on the ground. I hope I'll get an ambassador confirmed in Saudi Arabia before too long. His directive for me will be to continue to talk about these things in a way that we've done for, I think this predates me, but certainly for my entire...
You putting any pressure on them to do something? I mean...
We've seen some progress, right? We've seen.
Have?
Yeah, oh, sure. Oh, absolutely. I absolutely think we've seen
women are
some
still being
progress.
tortured. All right. Well, listen.
Yes.
I just want to say this. I think it is very important that you put as much pressure as possible to stop the torture that's going on to these women. All right. I'm going to find something else we can agree on. I know this.
3 for 3.
We're 3 for 3. Now we're going to go 4 for 4, and that is that we can't. I don't mean, listen, I'm going to say this as an expression. We can't wall off the wall. I'm not going to, the world. I'm not talking about the south of the border, okay? That disease spreads. That if you, one of the reasons, it's not just humanitarian reasons that we go into, let's say, places like Africa to stop the spread of disease, whether it's HIV, Ebola, tuberculosis, all kinds of horrible things, because we know these diseases spread, correct?
Yes, ma'am. Global endemic is always, pandemic is always a real risk.
All right, so this is why I want to go back to the discussion that some of us had about this global gag rule, what I call this ultra obsession that your administration has with abortion. It's one thing, we don't use federal funds for abortion. I may disagree with that. But the fact of the matter is, your new interpretation of what was called a gag rule now is harming organizations that are doing just general health care, whether it is contraceptive care or HIV or just maternal care. I'm going to give you an example. There's an organization called Amadafia, I think I said it right, which is the only health provider in Mozambique. They have lost funding due to the expansion of the global gag rule. Estimated that it affects 500,000 people who are receiving care for HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria because they're closing their doors. So here's my question to you, is what kind of analysis have you done or you're doing to see or to understand the effect of cutting off these funds?
So I appreciate the question. We do disagree on abortion, and I'll take that as a fact in how I respond to this. I cannot see how, first of all, you call it a gag rule. No one stopped from speaking anywhere. No, the gag implies, implies they can't speak.
I don't want to cut you off, but you know, you've taken it so far that an organization that doesn't even do abortions are not even allowed to, if they're asked a question where they can get an abortion, they're not allowed to be told. They're not allowed to even have a pamphlet lying around that gives women alternatives. So yes, it is a gag. Okay, maybe you had to look into it.
I'm happy to look into it, but there's no one being denied the right to speak. They can say what they want.
Okay, well, tell about how about getting the health care?
What they can't do is take U.S. taxpayer funds and perform abortions or abortion-related services. These are the activities, and we have continued to provide. There are not a single dollar reduction with respect to women's health care that is associated with the President's Mexico City policy and all the ways that we are implementing that. Not one single dollar reduction. It is perverse to think when I think about places like China, where most of the abortions that take place are women. It is perverse to me to say that denying abortion somehow.
Let me just reclaim my time.
Harms life.
Let me just reclaim my time to say this. Some of the things we agree. I mean, I don't believe in forced abortions. Okay. But I don't believe in forcing women to have children if they don't want to have children. But here's the thing. I'm urging you, I am begging you to please Do an analysis of how this gag rule is affecting healthcare around the world, because you and I both agree that when women succeed, the world succeeds. And with that, I yield back.
And with that, I turn to Ms. Torres.
Thank you. We're back to Central America. I'm concerned about the reliability of some of our security partners in the region, specifically in the Northern Triangle. And I want to make sure that we aren't sending good money, after bad. I'm not confident that Honduras government is a reliable partner in the fight against narcotics, narco trafficking. They recover less than 1% of what is trafficked through the country. That is not even the cost of doing business for a narco trafficker. So on that note, are you aware that on November 26, 2018, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York indicted Juan Antonio Hernandez Alvaro, President Hernandez's brother, on drug trafficking charges?
Yes.
So
I didn't know the date, but I knew of the indictment. Yes, ma'am.
So according to the indictment, Mr. Hernandez had access to cocaine labs in Honduras and Colombia. This cocaine was tagged or marked, stamped TH for his initials, Tony Hernandez. Are you confident that President Hernandez was unaware that his brother is an alleged narco trafficker?
May I answer that for you in a different forum, please? But here's what. But I will try and answer the question that you're getting to with respect to the policy.
I'm
we do have
happy
real
to
concerns.
do a classified briefing on this.
Just there's ongoing. Anyway, I just prefer to do that if that's acceptable.
I can respect that. I'm very concerned that we continue to work with people and invite them to groundbreaking ceremonies for our U.S. Embassy buildings when we should not be doing business with these people. And we should be holding them accountable for the crisis that is happening at our southern border. We have to be serious about holding these three governments accountable for what they are doing, forcing young children and women out of their countries. Look, I was one of those kids. My parents didn't see a future for me in Guatemala. They sent me to the U.S. To live with my father's oldest brother. No parent should have to make that decision. No child's future should be robbed from being able to have a successful life where they were born. And I think that we can agree on that. And I hope that we will continue to pay attention to the region and to hold people accountable, including the State Department. The State Department is severely underfunded. I don't blame them for some of those missteps that they have taken, but at the same time, we have to put on a serious face in front of these people. The attacks against CSIG, while we may disagree on press releases that might have been sent, and it wasn't from them, it was the Attorney General's office. You and I know that CSIG is an investigative body. Their charge is to investigate corruption, and hopefully someday that these governments will be able to do their own investigations. That's not happening, not with President Morales. It is not happening with Moxie, with President Hernandez in Honduras. I'm hopeful that in El Salvador, with the new president, we will have an opportunity to do better. But we can't do better with a new administration when we are showing a terrible example of continuing to support bad actors in these two other countries.
I'm sorry, you didn't ask a question.
I didn't, but I would like you to respond and commit. Last year, we passed an amendment in the NDAA, which required the State Department to provide Congress with a report that includes a list of corrupt elected officials. They were supposed to do this 180 days after the NDAA was enacted. To my account, it's 226 days now, long overdue. Can we expect that sometime in the near future?
Yeah, I will look into that. I was unaware that we had a due out that was overdue, and I will absolutely look into that and get you a response on when we believe we can complete that task. That legally required task.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Before I turn to Mr. Rogers, I want to thank you, Ms. Torres, for your comments. And I do want to say, Mr. Secretary, I think there's about $1.2 billion left in that account from it was called the U.S. Strategy for Engagement in Central America. We had appropriated $4 billion, and there's about $1.2 billion left in the account. I would hope that we can continue this discussion. It would be good to know, from your perspective, what we've accomplished, what remains to be accomplished, a great deal, and what we can do about it. I'm not sure it's just another $1 billion. That's a lot of money. But I would like to see from you a review of all of our actions that have, frankly, addressed the serious challenge in the region.
We'll provide that to you and your committee and to the ranking
member
as well.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, Syria. I understand the top U.S. objective there is the enduring defeat of ISIS. I assume that means not only the destruction of the caliphate, which has occurred, but also preventing a return of the conditions that allowed ISIS to arise in the first place. During testimony before Congress earlier this year, the U.S. commander of CENTCOM said, and I quote, "The coalition's hard-won battlefield gains must be secured by continued interagency efforts in mobilizing the international community to prevent a return of the conditions that allowed ISIS to arise." To accomplish that goal, what sort of sustained efforts, political, diplomatic, military, will be required of us and our partners in eastern Syria?
So with your permission, let me extend it to eastern Syria and western Iraq, the place that the caliphate existed as a contiguous institution. It will take efforts in each of those two places that have mostly a political and diplomatic component to them. So there'll be an element of diplomacy, pure political diplomacy, humanitarian assistance, reconstruction aid. We will need to continue the Defeat ISIS coalition, which can not only bring people but resources, money, to this challenge that's going to take the reconstruction in these places is going to be an enormously costly undertaking. Second, there's the political piece, which is the work that we need to do. I'll meet with the Speaker of the House equivalent from Iraq, who's traveling here to the United States this week. I'll meet him this week to work with the political leadership in Iraq to assist them with building out the Iraqi security forces, so that they can maintain control and keep their own country secure so that ISIS can't arise. And it's not just ISIS, right? In Idlib and in Syria, we've got all other forms of radical. We've got al-Nusra Front. The list is long. So this threat of terrorism in the region remains. It's going to take a political resolution in Syria to create the conditions where Syria can both begin to rebuild and begin to build out its security forces as well. It's an enormous undertaking.
But you don't request any funds for Syria in your budget.
We don't. We're not there yet. We can't operate in 2/3 of Syria today. And we won't operate while Assad continues to be there and wreak the devastation that he has until we've got a pathway where we have a political resolution. So we believe we have the resources to continue to do the work in the eastern third, the northeast part of Syria, to work, frankly, with the Kurds and the Turks so that we get an outcome there that is stable and lasting as well, that underwrites the capacity to take UN Security Council 2254 and implement it. That's the mission statement. We believe we have the resources to do that. And by the way, there are also resources that aren't inside the State Department budget, right? Your quote was from someone at CENTCOM, if I remember correctly. There are DOD resources that will be a central component of that as well.
In the short term, how are we going to help our friends, the Syrian Democratic Forces? How do we help them cope with the large number of captured foreign fighters?
I'm glad you asked this question. This challenge of foreign terrorist fighters that reside today mostly in eastern Syria, although some are being transported to other places, is a real threat. I had a pretty senior military leader remind me that he did not want his children and grandchildren fighting these same terrorists, the same human beings, because we detained them. He risked his life to get them, and that we were risking putting them back out on the street. The State Department has led an effort to repatriate these places to countries where they have systems, justice systems, and the capacity to hold them for an extended period of time. But I'm mindful, some of the terrorists that were captured early on in this fight after 2011 had 20-year prison sentences. They'll be getting out pretty soon. This risk of foreign terrorist fighters and their reentry when they have not changed their ways and their desire to destroy America, destroy the West, and commit acts of jihad is a very real challenge.
And they're of many different nationalities.
Yes, they come from, we've repatriated to countries in Northern Africa, we've repatriated to Arab countries. We've asked every country to take back those that are own, and then we have many that we won't be able to return for a host of reasons. And we've got to find a solution, which we have not yet done. State Department and Department of Defense are working closely with the Iraqis and others to figure out the best way to ensure they don't return to the battlefield. It's a real challenge.
Mr. Secretary, you've been very generous with your time with us today. We thank you very much for.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I appreciate that.
Mr. Secretary, I too want to thank you again for spending this time with us. I'd like to ask you if you think the State Department has gotten its swagger back. Do you have adequate resources to fund your important work, both here and overseas? And as we contemplate your budget for 2020, if there are specific requests, we'd be happy to assist you in your very important work. So has the State Department gotten the swagger back?
I hope so, but I'll leave that to others to judge. I'll leave those here in America and those around the world to make that decision. I hope they have. It has been an incredible privilege to lead amazing diplomats, civil servants, foreign service officers, and local employed staff around the world who are doing remarkable work while I've been the Secretary of State and been so fortunate to be their leader. I hope I've helped them perform their function better, and that's what I really meant by get your swagger back.
Well, I appreciate that, and I must say I am honored to be chair of this subcommittee. It's a choice, and all of us who serve on this committee made this important choice, so we want to be sure that we are responding to your request, to the urgent needs. I know we can't solve all the problems of the world, but we certainly would like to work with you to address the many, many challenges we have. So in closing, thank you very much. And this concludes today's hearing. The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs stands adjourned, and I thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for conducting a very professional hearing. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Trying to find out where it is. I don't have access to your calendar right now. Sorry.